Hello, this is Kenneth here with the Advancing Equity Coalition. Here to give y'all a quick update on the Cruz-Guzman case. And we're here today once again with the Executive Director of Ad Allies, Josh Crossan. Hi, Josh. How are you doing today?
Hey, Kenneth, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Good. Spring is in the air, so I have a
Yeah,
little bit of allergies, so I apologize for the coughs and the sneezes.
no worries. Thanks for joining us again. I know that
Yeah,
people really enjoyed our legislative update.
yeah,
And then with the recent news around Cruz-Guzman coming out, I thought this would be a great opportunity to just talk a little bit more about this case, what it is, why is it so important, why have districts been kind of trying to figure out what's happening, and so I thought it'd be great to have you back and kind of share what's going on. So thanks for joining us
yeah,
again.
yeah. Thanks for having me.
So yeah, I would love if you could just share with us a little bit about like what is this case, who's involved, how have you all been involved, why do you know so much about it?
Yeah,
Yeah, and so if you could just start with that, that'd be great.
yeah, definitely. So a few years ago now, it feels like a long time ago, but a few years ago, a lawyer by the name of Dan Schulman put together a lawsuit that said that the courts need to decide on the quality of an education and remedy high quality education, or I should say, remedy poor quality education. And the only thing that we need to be looking at is how integrated a school is, or in other words, making sure that the right amount of kids of color are in a school with the right amount of white students. And so he put this lawsuit together and said, I'm going to sue the state around this. The state said their response was the court shouldn't play a role in the quality of an education, let alone talk about what kind of variables go into a high quality education. So we're gonna defend based on the courts should play no role here. The state ultimately lost that decision, the case moved forward. A case called Cruz-Guzman, the leading families in this lawsuit, and there was a third group that was like, I agree that the courts should decide the quality of an education. I disagree that the only thing that we should be looking at is whether or not a school is integrated. I think that this third group we call the interveners. So you have Dan Schulman, the plaintiff, you have the state, that's the defendant, and you have this third group, the interveners. We're saying we need to look at other things like student outcomes, graduation rates, proficiency rates, whether or not a student feels comfortable and safe in their environment, social emotional learning. Like, there are a lot of equitable access to high quality teachers. There are a lot of different variables to what makes a good school beyond whether or not there are a right amount of kids of color or white kids in a classroom. This court case then went to mediation to avoid a lengthy lawsuit court hearing. And in mediation, you had these three parties. You had the plaintiffs, the defendants, and the interveners. Throughout this conversation, the plaintiffs and the defendants kind of got more aligned on their ideas of, okay, let's just figure this out, with specifically figuring out how do we integrate schools as a form of quality, while the interveners like Friendship Academy, which are, it's a diversity by design school. They serve over 90% Black students in art. They're like, hey, wait a minute, if you start to focus on integrating our schools without understanding the quality of education that we provide to our students, especially our students of color, you're going to undermine and disrupt our mission of serving Black students and serving Black students well. So I still have a concern about this being a solution. So this mediation started happening. One thing that really happened that we were like, wait, what? Where the mediators decided to kick out the interveners. So they really only had the plaintiffs and the defendants, while the interveners were kind of like, can we please still have a say in this conversation? Fast forward to last week, was it? Where we had a bill that was introduced that was claimed to be the settlement. This was an agreement between the plaintiffs and the defendants, but the interveners had no role in creating this settlement. So there were some things that the interveners liked, And there were a lot of things that the interveners did not like, and we thought they thought that would undermine their role. Where Ed Allies falls in all of this, we're not a school that's directly impacted, but as our name kind of states, we are allies to schools that serve kids, especially serves kids of color well. So we've been really helping think through of like, what are some of those variables for a high quality education, and kind of developing ideas and relationships between the lawyers, between the interveners on like, what can we be thinking about to improve school quality that doesn't undermine the mission of diversity by design schools, mostly diversity by design charter schools, but all schools are kind of like falling into this.
Wow, that's a lot. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing. I mean, I think it's hard because it's like so complicated, and we're jumping from, I know a lot of our folks follow what's going on in Minneapolis, and then we're jumping to not only what's happening in Minneapolis, but what's happening at the state. But then we're not even just talking about bills now, we're talking about a lawsuit and plaintiffs and defendants and interveners and all that kind of stuff. And, the parties seem to be trying to also jump back and forth between where they want to find their solutions. But something that really I think is important to understand about this case, and that really jumps out to me and has jumped out to me from the very beginning, is the idea that what makes a good school is the students who are in it, or what makes a quality school is the type of students that are in that school. And there has to be the right mix, right? Like there has to be the right mix of white students and students of color. And, I think what we're also implicitly saying is like a school is fundamentally broken because of who's in the school, what students go to that school. It has nothing to do with the administration. It has nothing to do with the adults in the building. It's all about like what students choose to go to that school. And I think that's a really, really messed up stance for the state to just agree to, and for people to start making these lawsuits about. And I think, the way that we've talked about segregation and integration has really done a disservice to, kind of the direction of where this lawsuit is going, because we do deny certain groups of students opportunities based on who they are. But that doesn't mean that school can't be great because of what students are there. That just means we need to do a much better job of figuring out how are we going to make sure that students of color get the same opportunities that white students get, and not just by making sure that they're all in the same building all the time.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And
segregation.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Kenneth. Yeah, no, I was going to say segregation exists within a school building too. So to say that the number of students of color and white students in a building automatically creates high quality education because we value white students more is also a farce. Yeah, our system does value white students more and white minds more, which is creating deep disparities between schools. But when students of color are in schools, they're also treated poorly, regardless of how integrated the school is. So you're absolutely right. The solution isn't let's find a right balance between how many kids of color and white students are in a school building. Let's figure out how do we provide resources and what students need specifically, based on where they are and what they need in an equitable way. I just wanted to double down on that. I absolutely agree.
I mean, it's ridiculous to think that if we get the right mix, that students of color are automatically going to have better outcomes. Like we see so many families of color try to go to whiter schools within Minneapolis, out in the suburbs, wherever, and there's still this huge disparities in those schools. We're talking about we're talking about suspensions with discipline referrals and suspensions. We're talking about access to rigorous coursework or advanced coursework, who's diagnosed with different special education stuff. Like we all know this is highly racialized within a school. So then why is the Dan Schulman and the state ready to say, okay, you know what, we're not going to look at outcomes because that doesn't matter. We're not going to look at anything else. All we're going to look at is a school is good if there are the right numbers of white students and the right numbers of students of color. And I say that intentionally, white students and students of color, because part of this case also is that they're not looking at, how many Black students are in a school, or how many Latinx students are in a school. They're just saying all students of color, we see you as one. We don't
Yep.
see you as different. We see you as one. Um, so yeah, why won't they consider it? Why isn't the Attorney General, why isn't Attorney General Ellison not saying, no, wait, there's so much more to this than just what students are in a school.
Yeah, and I think, and I'll add there, it's not only students of color, but it's also poverty. So they're conflating being a person of color with being in poverty. So you can have 20% 20% Latinx, 20% Black, 20% Asian Pacific Islander, um, uh,
Indigenous.
20% white above poverty, and 20% white below poverty. And that in their minds, that's 80% racially impoverished, isolated schools that we need to disrupt in some way, because that's 80% is the number they're looking at. They're not looking at all of the different, you know, um, um, tiles of the fabric that create the school. They're just saying 80% are the thing that we need to fix. And if how to fix that is we need to welcome fewer students of color into the school, or we need to welcome more wealthier, whiter students into this school in order to become fully integrated. And they see us as people of color and people in poverty as a problem that needs to be fixed, rather than providing more resources to our schools. Why I say why? I think a couple of reasons. One, um, I think Dan Schulman is a well-respected white guy, and his concerns are not easily just dismissed by the state. I think that I mean, you've seen it, Kenneth, lawsuits that are led by people of color, and lawyers of color are often dismissed by the state, being like, "Oh, go away." While Dan Schulman has kind of a reputable background and saying like, "Oh, we'll take you seriously because you're an older white guy with power." Um, and then the second thing is, I think a lot of people are just afraid of the conversations around integration. I know that I grew up thinking that integration is always good no matter what. Coming into this conversation and saying, "Oh, wait, people are using integration in order to undermine my communities of color. Like they're using it to take choice away from families of color. They're using it's mostly like these white-led advocates. They're using integration to undermine good schools that are serving us well, not to undermine white schools, but to undermine my community schools. And I think it's a third rail in society today to say, "Oh, you're fighting for integration. Well, I disagree with you." What we need to be saying instead is, "You're fighting for integration. Well, that better be a strategy to improve the learning for Black and Brown students, not as a strategy to undermine and close our schools."
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we talk about like integration, and we could go all the way into this, but we'll save this for a different day. But I think as we talk about integration in this way, what we're really saying is we're okay with a system that values white students more, and like actually physically gives white students more dollars, or more opportunities, or whatever it is. We're okay with that system. We just need to make sure that they're evenly distributed across, the city or across the state, so that,
Yeah.
some of the Black kids and some of the Latinx kids can also benefit secondhand off of those dollars that come in,
Right.
which
Right.
is really hard. And, we know that, Minnesota also has a pretty good funding formula to make sure that students of color get, actually are assigned resources to them. And I say all the time, white students in Minneapolis public schools get so much opportunity that it's unbelievable, off of the backs of students of color, like all the resources and dollars that black students, Latinx students, Indigenous students,
Yeah.
second or English as a second language students, right? Like Minneapolis white students get so many resources based off of all of the things, all the dollars that and opportunities that students of color bring into the district, that
Yeah.
they get some of the best education in the state.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
I know we talk a lot about like, oh, Minneapolis public schools isn't serving students of color. We don't talk enough about how well Minneapolis public schools is serving white students and the type of opportunities that they get.
Yeah. Yep.
And
And
so,
there's a reason why a lot of white Minneapolis parents are trying to defend this system. They're benefiting a lot by it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, there's a reason why they're leading those efforts of do not change a good thing that I'm getting.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so absolutely. So I mean, I think yeah, that's right. And I think, but I think Minneapolis needs to be thinking about this lawsuit in a way that impacts them. Um, One thing that's in the legislation that was introduced and had an informational hearing around was the idea around like how do we disrupt racially isolated and economically isolated schools. So they break down schools based on 5 different tiers. Tier 1, tier 2 are more diverse schools and schools with more kids that are free and reduced price lunch or in poverty. Then you have tier 4 and tier 5 schools, which are wider, wealthier districts. In this agreement,
Sorry, wait.
there. Oh,
Tier
sorry.
4, tier 5, is it wider, wealthier districts or wider, wealthier individual schools?
Sorry, wider, wealthier schools. That's
Okay.
right. Yeah. So in this conversation, there's kind of this sweet spot of you need to have between 40 to 60% of your school are kids of color, and if you go beyond that, if you too many kids of color, then we need to figure out how you can be welcoming more whiter, wealthier students, which we know is probably not going to happen, right? If you're a high poverty, mostly community of color, I like whiter, wealthier school or students and parents are probably not flocking to your school. So the other response is how do we bus Black and brown students and students in poverty out of your school to change the ratio so that the white students that are currently in your school make up a larger proportion of that. So what we're going to be seeing though is students moving. I'm in North Minneapolis, right? So students in Patrick Henry or North High, if that's considered a racially isolated school, the idea of busing those students to tier 4 and tier 5 schools is going to be the next effort. My first frame of reference was I'm right next door to Robbinsdale. So does that mean I would have to send my kids from Patrick Henry to Robbinsdale? And the response I got in asking that question was no, because Robbinsdale isn't even a tier 4 or tier 5 school. So you would need to send your kids to like Eden Prairie, Edina, right? Like the Minnetonkas, where like South Minneapolis schools, where you are actually meeting that tier 4, tier 5 requirement. So you're going to see a lot of district resources going into moving kids around so they get to the right percentage of students. And you're probably going to see a lot of district flight, right? Like Minneapolis Public Schools is really afraid of how many kids are leaving the district. This is going to kind of inspire more of that. So, and this is kind of why also where a lot of the legislators who are historically anti-charter schools, we're still having a lot of concerns with this bill because it would take resources away from the district and kind of put them into moving students around rather than towards their education.
So I just want to make sure that we're clear on this because this is such a new topic and we're
Yeah.
jumping between a lot of systems. So earlier we talked about like the basis of this lawsuit is around trying to equate quality or adequate schools to whether they're integrated or not. And so
Yeah.
now what Josh just talked about is like the agreement that the defendants and the state that Cruz-Guzman and the state have come to, right? And so can you just really quickly share again, like what are the big points around like the agreement that they presented at an informational hearing in the legislature?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So like I said, the interveners, the charter schools that are diversity by design, they were kicked out of the agreement altogether. The plaintiffs and the defendants, so Cruz-Guzman and the state, came together and had this agreement. They put this agreement forward to the legislature and said, hey, can you pass this before we go to a lawsuit, before we go to court? So the courts and the legislature are kind of playing chicken right now. It's who's going to pass the policy first. And so the legislature just last week had a hearing on what's in this like proposal. It was framed, Attorney General Keith Ellison framed it as, we already came up with a settlement. All you have to do is pass it. That's pretty disingenuous because that does not include the concerns of the interveners. But what's included in there is this inter-district busing that I talked about, where it's moving kids around to get to the right percentage of kids of color in each school. What's also included in there is undermining charter schools that are diversity by design. So it says if you're a charter school that has 80% more kids of color or kids in poverty, you are considered isolated, and we need you within the next 3 years to reduce the number of students who are students of color or impoverished below 80%. So again, like Kenneth, like you said, if you're 20% Black, 20% Latinx, 20% Asian, 20% white students who are free and reduced lunch or poverty, like you are going to be in this like category, and your charter school is going to have to focus away from educating your kids of color well and focus more on recruiting white wealthy kids into your school, and possibly also not accepting students of color into your school until you get to that below 80%. So places like Friendship Academy, that is again a Black school. It's a school for Black students to learn the standards through the arts. Would 95% Black would have to deny Black entry in order to get white students up to above 20%. I live, by Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center. We have Hmong specific charter schools. They would have to stop admitting Hmong schools so that their white student population gets to be above 20% within their schools within the next 3 years. If they don't meet that requirement, the Department of Education could do things like withhold funding, withhold their charter, really hurt these schools. So it is an effort to eliminate diversity by design schools. So that's also in this agreement. It creates things like magnet schools where they're focusing, again, 40% to 60% students of color or students in poverty. And it creates these like 5 tiers. So these are kind of the things that we have some concerns around. There are some good things in this settlement agreement. There's culturally responsive teaching and restorative practices. I know, Kenneth, you and I have worked on restorative practices for a while. There are things like that in this bill that need to be considered. Those are things that the interveners said, hey, we need to include this in high quality education. And the plaintiffs and defendants were like, yeah, sure, we'll like that. We like that. But they didn't give up on the how do we undermine schools that are serving kids of color and students and low income students well. They didn't give up on that part, but they did take some of our other recommendations.
All right.
It's a lot, but it's a lot. But the short of it, the summary, they're trying to disrupt the schools that we go to. They're trying to get rid of Black and brown schools because there are too many Black and brown kids that go there.
So, and what you kind of shared with me as we were prepping for this in terms of like what's next in the process. So last week, this was an informational hearing. It wasn't an official bill hearing. So, this policy is not really going anywhere unless something drastic happens this year. So it was an informational hearing. But what they're trying to have happen is they want the state and Dan Schulman essentially want to have this decided in the legislature so that the courts have to rule based on the agreement that they've laid out, right? And so when you say they're playing chicken, it's like a race around who can actually rule on this first, because if it's in the court's hands and the courts can kind of do whatever, and they might try to get discovery. So they're going to need to make information available that we could all look at, and probably could be really bad for especially like the state.
Right.
And so they're trying to do everything that they can to prevent that from happening. And so one of the ways of doing that is trying to get the legislature to pass a bill.
Yes.
So then where is the state legislature on that? Where are the Democrats? Where are the Republicans? Where's the House? Where's the Senate? What's happening? Do we have any information on where the governor is on any of this also?
Yeah. So, well, Keith Ellison, the state's attorney general, testified on this and saying, you have to pass this. You have to pass this agreement. Like, we don't want to go to court. You're gonna have to testify in court and explain yourself on education. Like, do you want the courts to be involved in your education? So a lot of fear tactics of, you better pass this now so that we don't have to go to court. The goal is, like you just said, the goal is to pass legislation so the courts can just kind of be done with this and pass the policies that are going to harm a lot of kids. Where is the legislature on this? I will say that Republicans, by and large, disagree with the premise of this settlement. It hasn't been heard in the Republican-led Senate. Um, uh, Republicans in the House haven't voiced any support at all. I'd say Republicans in the Senate haven't really voiced their support at all. They've been really quiet, actually, but their silence speaks for itself in that they're not doing a lot to kind of advance this proposal. And with Democrats, I would also say a lot of really great questions from Democrats. Representative Jordan, Representative Joachim asked some really poignant questions about how does this impact their districts? How does this impact their parents? I'll say I was personally taken aback. I was a little surprised that the Democrats were like, wait a minute, this like you're gonna disrupt choice for my families in what way? And so I would say that there is, bipartisan concern, bipartisan skepticism around this plan. And I'm interested to see kind of what happens next. Representative Dabney, the chair of the Education Finance Committee, he brought this forward, kind of just leading the conversation around this bill. But during the informational hearing, there was not a lot of support around it. So it'll be fascinating to see what comes of this next. I also think that this hearing could be used as a tool for the plaintiffs and the defendants to go back to the courts and say, or to the judge and say, the legislature is taking this seriously. They already had a hearing about it. That'll be very disingenuous because it was an informational hearing. It was not actually like one that advances legislation. And during that hearing, there was a lot of healthy skepticism about this policy.
Man, all right. So a lot of games are being played. And it's unfortunate that we're doing this with kids' lives, but
yep,
that's what we decided we want to do as a state. All right. So what can we look forward to? What's going to happen next? How are we able to stay involved? How are we able to keep hearing more things about this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So May 17th is the next kind of court date. This is going to be where we're going to get more information about what's going to happen in this lawsuit. So we'll get more information there. We're going to be holding some community listening sessions and public sharing about what's going on in this lawsuit and how people might be able to get involved. I think the one way for folks to really get involved is come to those listening sessions, come to those, learn a little bit more about what this kind of legislation, what's happening in the courts, and how it impacts you in your district, and speak out. If there's more public discourse around, there's a lot of public discourse around CDD. I know you know that. This is going to have a similar effect, or I should say, this is going to have an effect on what schools can exist in this state, and whether or not your students or your kids can go to the school that you want them to go to, whether that's a charter school or a traditional district school. This is going to have an impact there. So if people learn more about this and speak out wherever they land on this issue, then it could help inform the legislature a little bit more on like where they need to stand on this policy. As for the courts, that's a little bit less of a public discourse environment, but we have some great lawyers. Nakima is actually helping out with the interveners. So we have some great lawyers, some great interveners, some great schools that are in the process of working out. I would say give the interveners a pat on the back. Charvez Russell, Dr. Russell, he's been like just amazing in his testimony and standing strong for his students. So wherever you can on that level, but like on the public discourse level, let your legislator know where you are on this and how it might impact you in your schools.
That's great.
And learn more about we're going to have more listening sessions. So stay tuned for that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really important. I think, I'll say for me, even as we start to get stuff into like the legal system and the court system, I'm like, oh, well, there's nothing I can do. I just have to wait and see what, the judge says or what the lawyers say or whatever. But I think remembering that there's a part of this that somehow, some way exists in the legislature allows people to say, okay, well, like I have I have reps, I have senators. Like they need to know where I stand on this and why they actually should let the courts maybe like go through their whole process of, and maybe we get to a trial and we learn some things and we have different, we allow the voice of the interveners to actually play a role in what solutions are shaped. And so I
Yeah.
think that will be important. So my just last quick question for you
Yeah.
is, where do things currently stand with mediation? So now that the agreement has been presented in the hearing, are they like done with mediation? And then like with the interveners, since they've been kicked out, are they just kind of in the same boat as us where they have to try to make noise from the outside?
TBD.
Yeah.
On May 17th, we'll hear a little bit more from the judge and where they want us to go. The judge could say, "I need you to continue mediation, and I need you to include the interveners." It may be an update on what happened and not much else. So we don't really know what's going to come from that May 17th conversation, but I think whatever does come from May 17th will give us kind of next steps on where this process is going. What the last thing I'll just say is, if you are a student at a school that serves more than 80% students of color and low income students, I'm actually on the board of Northeast College Prep, which is a school that does serve more than 80% students of color and low income students. You're being targeted right now. There are efforts right now to make sure that your school doesn't exist, and to eliminate schools like yours. So beyond talking to your legislature, beyond understanding how the courts process, it's super important. If you're a student, if you're a parent, if you're an educator at one of these schools, it's super important to kind of in the public sphere, whether that's an op-ed, a blog, a radio show, just voice your concern around efforts of people trying to shut your schools down, and really wanting to make sure that, like, I mean, I've heard story after story after story of my culturally responsive school saved my life. Now more than ever, those stories are needed. So one thing I'll say is Ed Allies has a blogging fellowship. We will pay you to share your story. So if you're looking for a place to share your story, please reach out to us at Ed Allies, and look out for other opportunities to kind of learn more about this case.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up. Josh, thank you so much for hopping on again and teaching us so much about what's going on at the state. I think I learned a lot around how this will impact MPS, and I think a lot of our followers are also very concerned about how things will impact MPS. So it's just great to have a partner at the state who's watching things at the state and helping us figure out, okay, how does this impact us locally? So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Kenneth. Yeah, have a good week.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
See ya.